Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the TactiCon 2023 panel discussion about music in strategy games. I am Jaakko Vesterinen, narrative designer of a sci-fi grand strategy game, The Pegasus Expedition by Kalla Gameworks, and I'm joined here by my dear colleague Adam Al-Sawad, the composer of the entire soundtrack of that Pegasus Expedition.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So I thought we'd first discuss the music in the strategy games in general a bit and then look at some examples in the strategy game soundtrack you have just composed. So I have the game open here in the background, so we'll have some music already. It's nice to talk about music with music. And then let's move to our first subject or question, which is that I know that you have composed music for other genres like puzzle games, Metroidvanias, and now this now you've done a strategy game soundtrack. So you have experience from multiple genres, and I wanted to ask, what's different? What is different with music in strategy games? Simple question, but I don't think it's a simple answer.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest difference, at least for me, is the segmentation of the soundtrack. So basically, when we're talking about other types of games, you're a lot more free in how you categorize your different tracks. But in strategy games specifically, I think there generally is a larger difference between game paces in different parts of the game. For example, a lot of strategy games have separate combat and management sections, or even different types of management sections, and each of those have their own game pace, their own narrative feel in a lot of different games, and also different goals that developers want to achieve in terms of what the player is feeling in those specific situations. So basically, when composing music for a strategy game, you have to really segment your soundtrack a lot more, create these different categories for these different gameplay situations, and the differences could be pretty harsh actually, depending on how intense certain aspects of the game are when compared to the next.
Yeah, about intensity, I have heard a claim that strategy game music should be like it should be unique, as all music in games should be, but also it has that quite specific demand that it has to be enough in the background. It must not be too intense and must not steal the spotlight, or be too intense in the sense that it gets tiresome to listen to it over and over. I mean, people probably play Metroidvanias many hours to people who love them much, but still, I don't know if those hours compare to like those hundreds and maybe even thousands of hours of grand strategy games. So that's a different kind of pressure to the soundtrack.
Definitely. I think that's a very good point, that strategy games are games that usually are really worn out in terms of gameplay time, at least from the point of view of music. For example, when I was making music for Metroidvania, we had very specific estimates on how long each segment of the game, in this case, for example, each planet of the game, would take. But when making the Pegasus Expedition soundtrack, a player could be spending 100 hours in the grand campaign alone in one playthrough, not to mention combat and narrative situations. And a lot of as a strategy gamer myself, I've spent a lot of time in various strategy games. I could be spending 300 hours in the same specific part of the game listening to the same music. So I really need to take into account how I can make the music so that it won't take too much out of the gameplay experience. It won't start to be too repetitive, but at the same time, that it tells the story that that specific situation needs to tell, or that specific gameplay element needs to tell, and it sets the tone for the specific strategy management or the like that the designers want.
Yeah. To talk about continue from that, you mentioned segmenting and like 3 different segments in the case of the Pegasus Expedition, and I think it would be interesting to like showcase them here and like specify why we wanted, or especially you wanted, it to be the way it is. So the 3 segments, what were they?
Yeah. So in terms of the Pegasus Expedition, we have 3 segments or 3 categories in our soundtrack. So basically, the first is Grand Campaign, the second is Narrative, and the third is Combat. So to put it shortly, our Grand Campaign music is the music that you hear in the star map. So basically, it's supposed to be the most ambient and something that's telling the general story and feel of settling a new galaxy, exploring the unknown, the vast empty space that you need to sail in, while in a hurry to find some way to save humanity. So with that category, pretty much I wanted to have some unique feeling instruments. I took some inspiration from, for example, post-rock, to have that eerie, ghostly ambient feel, while having science fiction elements there as well, to create that feel of desperation within the game, And then for our narrative pieces, there are actually a lot of different playlists. So, for example, with the Grand Campaign type music, we only have a few playlists. So the general playlist, which is pretty long, and then for a few specific turns that have very specific things happening in them within the story, we have their own Grand Campaign music. But for the narrative music, we have, I think it's 16 different playlists. So 15 different specific playlists for specific moods or factions, and then one general playlist, which is, I think, only 8 or 9 minutes long, with, I think, 7 short tracks, set a general feel for the dialogue without emphasizing a very specific theme or feeling.
Okay.
Then in terms of
I think I would like to discuss the 4X music a bit more before we go too deeply to the other ones.
Yeah.
And now we are listening to the 4X map soundtrack. And I think we have like... How many songs do we have here? Was it 5, 6? Quite longish.
We have
songs.
seven songs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, one thing I noticed about our game when I was playing some other strategy games the other weekend here, and they many do it so that they have different songs, and then the song ends, and there's of course a pause, and then a new song starts. But we did that differently, didn't we?
Yeah. We actually built into our music engine the possibility to blend the songs together, and I composed and rendered the songs so that they blend in together. So basically, what we are doing is the next song is starting to play before the previous song actually ends. So what we wanted to achieve with that is having the sound bed of our music actually be more seamless and emphasize the general feel of the game more with the music and its musical and narrative themes being more in conjunction with each other without separate pauses or so-called quiet spaces. And this is actually not only built into our star map music, but it is also taken into account between other music categories. So for example, when we switch from star map music to combat music, the star map music fades out and the combat music fades in with various layers, and we can go into detail with that later. But basically what I wanted was that when my music is actually used in the game, it's more seamless and less having specific tracks that begin and end, and players can notice when one begins and one ends in a way that takes away from the general gameplay experience. If you know what I mean.
That was something I was going to say next. That sometimes it happens that you're playing a game and then you suddenly notice that, oh man, it's quiet. What happened? And then you realize, okay, that was the pause between the two songs. So
yeah, exactly.
Well, what you wanted to do here is, kind of ambitious, but I like that it creates a seamless experience without that silence that wakes you up from the immersion, so to say. However, that probably means that you have to have planned for this before you compose the music. Like they have to be crafted to support the system. You can't do that very well afterwards, I guess. Am I right?
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of composing aspects to it, and we actually spend a lot of time tinkering with our music engine to make everything as seamless as possible. There are a lot of different weird kinks one has to think about from a technical perspective, and I was actually pretty surprised how much programming it took for everything to work smoothly. But in the end, I was very happy with the result, and definitely it served all the composing details I had taken into account while making the tracks themselves.
But what we're now going to do is we're going to the first combat situation. And that was one of the three segments you mentioned. So
yeah.
What happens there? What happens in the combat music?
Yeah, actually I didn't get the chance to talk that much about the combat music, but
Yep.
you were so excited about our grand campaign music. A worthy thing to be excited about. Anyway, yeah. Actually, well, as you might know, my plan for the combat music in the beginning was very different to what we actually went with in the end. And that was a very interesting journey in terms of actually having the game tested and getting feedback from outside for our combat music. So what was designed at first by me was having various levels of intensity for combat, and then having the game switch the combat music based on the intensity level of the combat, or to say blend various intensity levels together. What actually ended up was it sounded too samey. Like in our combat, of course, there are a lot of tight situations, bombing a certain planet to destroy your enemy's artillery, and now you can steamroll them without getting too much repercussions and things like that. And what ended up happening is players actually hearing the same type of risers and the same type of changes in the combat music too much. So what we actually ended up doing is not having that intensity system at all, but keeping that blending element that we had in the intensity system, where we have a few different layers that we blend together. And how we used that was that we have the background layer that's playing when you start combat, before combat actually begins.
We're there now.
And yeah, and then actually when you start the combat, it starts blending in the rest of the combat music. But aside from that, we only have one combat playlist, which is far longer, to create more variance between different combats in terms of music.
Okay, so now to demonstrate what you just said, let's listen for a second, because now we have here the planning music, and now I've chosen my strategy and the combat starts, and we can softly hear the percussion and what else is in the actual combat version of the track, like blending in. And what you said was interesting in the sense that I like the idea of trying to match what the player is experiencing with the music. The idea is beautiful, and if it wouldn't get repetitive, I think it would have worked pretty well. But in these kind of games, you don't play 10 battles, you play hundreds of them. So, like, I agree with that. That maybe the player still has the better experience when they just have variety instead of the music matching the exact situation even better. Maybe we'll try something like that again sometime, but it was an interesting test.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest thing is that one would have to scale their combat soundtrack to be extremely long if they actually wanted to achieve that. I mean, I love the idea personally, and I would like to do it someday, but you know, it would really require to have hours of combat music for it to be effective, at least based on our gameplay tests.
Yeah, it may be that it requires a little bit different kind of game, because Pegasus Expedition is still grand strategy game, and I'd say combat is maybe 1/3 of the playtime or something. But if we have something that leans more heavily on like RTS genre and not that much grand strategy, then you would spend a lot more time in the combat, and then suddenly bigger part of the soundtrack is in combat, and that would change things slightly.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a very good point, that the mechanics play a big role as well. You know, in RTSs and games like that, there's a lot of variance between combat situations and how they can be epic, and it's a lot easier to determine as a player what is epic and what is not. You know, and go more in the flow of the game. You know, I'm a very data-driven person, and you know, after we got that feedback from our gameplay tests, I was really sure that in these types of strategy games, variance is key. You know, you're playing a lot of short combat situations, and having them all start a little bit differently in terms of music, for the most part, is definitely a plus in these types of strategy games.
For sure. Then now what we are seeing here, you are not seeing, but everyone else is seeing, is the dialogue situation with the Council of the Choselink Fleet, and now we have the generic, the main dialogue playlist playing. And that's an interesting story, because this neither is actually now what we planned initially. So initially we wanted to have, like you mentioned, 16 playlists out of 15, which are very unique. We wanted to have basically the opposite kind of soundtrack songs compared to the 4X music, because these ones the player would hear only a couple of times, and every single time would be somewhat memorable moment. At least we wanted to make them memorable moments. So the music suddenly wanted to take the center stage, and it wanted to be intensive and like more memorable, and in that sense maybe like more tiresome to listen to. But the player would be listening to it only like for a minute because the songs are short and the situations are short. And those worked very nicely in those situations, but not every situation is that intensive and that epic. And then we noticed that sort of dissonance with the epic and intense music and the situation where the characters are talking about something pretty mundane, like how Evan ended up as the diplomat of the expedition. He at one discussion he tells that story, and it's not very epic or intense, unfortunately. So yeah, and this is what we came up with.
Yeah, you know, well, as you know, when we started planning this soundtrack, you gave me a list of specific themes and emotions that you wanted to evoke with these various narrative tracks, and that's where we began. But as you said, we actually did make a lot of changes, also based on testing that really, I think, took these narrative tracks to the next level in terms of gameplay experience. So first of all, as you said, not all of the narrative situations were actually big enough to warrant their own music, and it actually caused a bit of narrative dissonance when we had a very emotional piece of music, you know, when one of your council members is just telling how they ended up to be a diplomat, you know. And we tested a few different solutions. We first tested having the general campaign music play during specific
Right.
specific narrative situations, you know, most of them that are not that intense, narratively speaking. And what actually ended up happening with that was that players felt that there wasn't enough difference between the narrative situations and the grand campaign mood-wise. So actually we ended up getting feedback about everything feeling too samey. So what we actually did then was have a separate general narrative playlist that played in all of those situations. And what ended up happening with that was we started actually getting different feedback. So by making changes in how we handled our music, we actually got positive feedback in something that players didn't realize was changed with music, which was very interesting and really taught me a lot about how we can actually change the player experience purely by analyzing how we compose music for these strategy games.
Yeah, this is just my personal feeling, and I'm not a composer myself, of course, but I feel like that maybe 20% of the game music is such that you actually remember it. It like hits that hard, or the song is memorable and the situation is memorable, and you maybe remember the actual music you heard. But most of the music
Yeah.
is the music that you don't actually remember. You remember the atmosphere and how it felt like and what you felt, and did you like the situation, but you don't actually remember what did you hear exactly. So in that sense, like that sometimes it can be a bit like that the music is very important, and it's even more important than you'd realize, judging from just the cover of the things. But often, like when it works, nobody notices anything, and when it doesn't work, that's when somebody notices something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the core principles of composing any media music evoking emotion or experience in conjunction with different aspects that are not music, visuals and text and the like. And definitely, I think what you brought up is very true, that we can't only compose music to be remembered, but we also need to compose music to support something else. And actually, that brings in mind something else we did with the narrative music, which was actually, in the beginning, it was supposed to be even more intense, even more emotional when compared to the rest of the game's music. I had a very strong principle of lending something from RPG soundtracks to evoke strong emotions with these strong large narrative moments. But what actually ended up happening was our players wanted to take more time to read and think about what they're going to answer, and I actually ended up bringing our narrative music's intensity down a notch to actually not be so much in front and not evoke so many emotions that the players felt too pressured to make their choices or take their time with the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, the game is turn-based, and even the dialogue is turn-based, actually.
Yeah.
So the player has all the time they want to make the decisions, and the decisions are sometimes pretty big. So it makes sense to ponder them for a while, and if we have that very aggressive soundtrack there, it can feel like that it's not in a balance.
Yeah, I actually remember in the beginning of development, I made our, I think, most intensive track that we didn't end up using, and you were so hyped up. You came into my studio room and was like, "Is that from our game? That's so cool! Oh, and it's so intense and things like that." And then when we actually put it in the game, our test players didn't end up liking it because it was so intense. And then in contrast with the game being a turn-based strategy game, it felt out of place.
Yeah, that demonstrates pretty nicely that how so much about that, whether the music works or not, the way it's intended depends on the situation. Because I heard it just it was playing out of your stereos in our studio, and I was like, "What's this? This is good," but I wasn't trying to make some difficult, complicated decisions at the same time while listening to it. That changed it quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure, and that just builds into the point that soundtrack music, for the most part, isn't supposed to be remembered in terms of every little detail. It's supposed to support the general gameplay and build upon the feelings and the experiences that the game designers want the players to feel. And sometimes too memorable is actually a thing.
Yeah, it sounds weird when you say it, but it makes sense with everything you've said here today.
For sure.
Oh, and you mentioned earlier that also that regarding to that, when we didn't change the background music at all when we swapped into a dialogue situation, so we just kept playing the 4X playlist, and that emphasizes that how I feel like the music is really big tool in making the player feel like the situation have changed. You are elsewhere, not physically maybe in these kind of games, but like mentally you're elsewhere. First I was hovering over the map, and oh, now I'm here in this room with these people, or now I'm in this big menu choosing something which is different place from watching the map. And I've seen and heard strategy games do it like with sound effects, or like, and sometimes with changing the soundtrack as well. And whenever possible, I think changing soundtrack feels like a good idea, because that makes you feel more like something has changed.
Yeah.
So one interesting thing about something to mention about 4X tracks is that few times, and only few times, we just walked over everything we just said here and did the opposite, and we left the narrative music play in the 4X map. But because we knew that is something that generally maybe does not work, we did it in very careful way, in the sense that when something very big happens in the story, like you end up with war with something new and big and very menacing, and that menacing thing has its own musical theme that plays in the discussions with them, and then when that war breaks out, for the rest of that one turn, actually you hear that theme on the 4X map as well, kind of to emphasize that okay, now everything is different now. But still, that when you click end turn and the next turn starts, it's back to normal, because I'm sure it would get annoying in the long run, but I feel like it's pretty cool for that one turn.
Yeah, that was definitely a tool that we had in use, but out of hundreds of turns, that's only a few turns. So we really wanted to use it sparingly to give emphasis to those specific moments.
Yeah, indeed. So, well, I have one more topic or question for you, the composer here. I think you have kind of answered this maybe, but if you want to kind of like pull it together in a one paragraph or something, because the question is, what is your vision and idea of the perfect grand strategy soundtrack, and like what kind of, if you have some kind of principles or something that guides you in trying to achieve that vision of perfect grand strategy game soundtrack?
Well, as someone who plays grand strategy games a lot, actually as a composer, I think the most important thing is, well, mechanically matching the intensity, as we've talked, but also telling the story and setting the narrative and world's mood of the game. So if we look at a lot of very popular grand strategy games, a lot of them actually tell a lot of narrative themes with their music, and actually build the world through sound and music as well. And I think that's something that really is emphasized in my ideal grand strategy soundtrack, or even strategy soundtrack in general. Not only because it's just generally a good thing to do in any game, but in terms of strategy games and grand strategy games specifically, those games very rarely have a lot of content that lets the player experience the world and immerse themselves while playing into the world. So music and even sound in general is something that can really work to immerse the players in worlds that are not emphasized that much in other gameplay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the better the composer and the rest of the development team kind of share the same idea and same vision of the game, the better results they're going to be with that. Like the better the music and everything else have the same vision about that, what is the end result going to be, the better the music supports and can actually kind of tell its own part of that. So, well, presuming that is the case, we tried to we used a lot of time to discuss and also like update the mutual vision of the end result. So it would be that what we all like planned and imagined that it would be.
Yeah, sitting on the sofa and listening to my music got really common for you.
Yeah, you have a sofa in your like office room, and I was jealous at first, but then I got used to sitting there and listening to your music, and then I understood that okay, if there's one place this sofa needs to be in, it's in your room. So yeah.
For sure.
So, well, we have now talked a lot about music in strategy games, and it's been very interesting for me as well, because okay, I've been working with you for a long time now, and I've worked with strategy game and strategy game music, but still it's been a long time since we sat down and talked about these things in this kind of detail, because what people maybe sometimes don't remember is that music in strategy games and in any game it's just not there. It's very deliberate process with a lot of planning and thinking, and it is intentionally the way it is for a reason.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to hear about those reasons, because there turn out to be quite a lot of them.
Yeah, and a lot of testing and analysis going with them.
Yep, for sure. So, well, we thank you, and we hope this was interesting to you. And
thank you. It was very nice to have this discussion.
Yeah, so I think that's it, and bye-bye.
Bye everyone.